Today on Book Break, we are looking at some of the writers behind the books. I am going to tell you about some of history's most outrageous poets with some of the best life stories. And I will of course put links in the description box to where you can find some of their poetry, which I think you will be even more intrigued to read after you hear some of what I'm going to tell you. I of course had to begin with arguably the most famous of them all, the eccentric poet Lord Byron. And where even to start with the list of weird things about him? Almost as famous as his poetry were his notorious sexual escapades. Apparently, doctors even had to advise him to cut down on the amount of sex he was having as they thought it might be dangerous for his health. And when he was at Cambridge, he was told he wasn't allowed to bring his pet dog with him, and so he brought a pet bear instead. He used to terrify other students by walking around the grounds, walking his bear on a lead, and even at one point tried to get him enrolled as a student. But even on top of all of that, possibly the strangest thing about him was his passion for the macabre, decorating his dining room with a coffin and allegedly turning the skulls of his ancestors into flower pots or drinking goblets. So he was definitely quite the character, but to meet another poet whose sexuality was a large part of their reputation, let's go all the way back to the ancient Greeks and meet Sappho. Sappho was a poet whose surviving poetry often focuses on love between women. We now have the word sapphic taken from her name, and she was from the Isle of Lesbos, where we get the word lesbian. So she was pretty much a gay icon, not least because, possibly to counter any suspicion about her sexuality, she claimed to have a husband named Kerkylas of Andros. Andros meaning man, and Kerkylas referring to male genitalia, so it's possible that this husband may have been a bit of a joke. For a very different kind of literary figure, we have Meera or Mirabai, a 16th century Hindu poet who allegedly wrote thousands of poems dedicated to the god Krishna, though experts do now disagree over how many of the poems can actually be attributed to her. Meera was so dedicated to Krishna that she actually claimed him as her husband, and so refused to acknowledge the man that she was actually married to. Her in-laws were completely scandalised to see her singing and dancing in public, openly conversing with holy men, so shocked in fact that they allegedly tried to have her killed. Meera did eventually leave her marital home, probably a good idea seeing as they were trying to kill her, and became a wandering saint, refusing to fit into the role expected for married women. For someone else who is the centre of multiple rumours, we have Christopher or Kit Marlowe. He was a poet but also a playwright, and his notoriety as a playwright comes largely from the long-standing debate as to whether he actually wrote any of Shakespeare's plays. And these theories range from asserting that he co-authored some of Shakespeare's plays to some people who believe that his death was actually faked to cover the fact that he wrote Shakespeare's entire body of work. And these aren't the only rumours that followed him. He was also suspected of being an atheist, controversial at the time, gay, also controversial at the time, and a government spy. Even today, very little is known as to the truth of any of these rumours. Now let's look at some warriors, starting with Calla Al Azwa, who, living in around 600 AD, was the daughter of the chief of an Arab tribe, and along with her brother was raised to be skilled in the art of poetry, horseback riding and swordsmanship. That last one in particular came in handy when her brother was taken hostage during a war against the Byzantines, so Calla disguised herself as a man in order to join the fight to save her brother. And she turned out to be such a good warrior that even when her identity as a woman was revealed, they still didn't kick her out, because she was just that good. And she did save her brother. Jin was a poet and a revolutionary, known as China's Joan of Arc. She was born in China but moved to Japan to study, where she became well known amongst her acquaintances for practicing martial arts and wearing Western male dress. And Jin was a strong feminist. One of her poets began with the line, "Do not tell me women are not the stuff of heroes," and a lot of her poems were about female warriors. And Jin fought hard throughout her life to make the world better for women and for any poor or oppressed people. She founded her own Chinese Women's Journal, and she ended up becoming involved in the military training of revolutionaries. When this was uncovered, she was publicly beheaded, instantly becoming a national hero and remaining to this day a symbol of women's independence. But where Qiu Jin stood out for her brave fight for justice, other poets have gone down in history for less savoury reasons. For example, Franois Voltaire is considered one of the finest lyric poets in French history, but that doesn't mean he was a great guy. Voltaire was always getting involved in drunken brawls, in one of which he actually stabbed a priest to death. He was banished, but then given a royal pardon. But then after he led a band of robbers to steal from the University of Paris, he was banished again. And prison records show that he never really seemed to learn from his mistakes, continuing to lead a life of violence and crime, but all the while churning out these beautifully intricate poems about love, suffering, and lost time. Another poet who couldn't seem to help getting into fights was Alexander Pushkin. He only lived to the age of 37, but in that time managed to be involved in at least 29 duels, the last of which is the one that killed him. And he seemed to get into duels over the slightest thing, from insults about his poetry to comments on his bad manners, which is a little ironic, to even arguments about the weather. And finally, of course, I had to include the famously dark and gothic Edgar Allan Poe. But what's particularly odd about Edgar Allan Poe is that despite all of the mystery and macabre in his work, he wasn't particularly odd at all. You won't find any of Byron's behaviour here. Much of his reputation was actually invented by a bitter literary rival who made up stories of madness and drug addiction that still are associated with his name today. And talking of his name, where Edgar sounds suitably gothic and serious, he often referred to himself as the considerably more normal Eddie. The weirdest thing he did do was he did marry his 13-year-old cousin when he was 27, which is very weird by today's standards especially, and his death was definitely bizarre. He was found stumbling through the streets of Baltimore wearing somebody else's clothes. He was brought into hospital and died 4 days later, but still nobody really knows what killed him. Right before he died, he was heard repeating the name Reynolds, so maybe Reynolds is the only one who knows the true story, whoever they were. So if any of those stories have caught your attention, like I said, I will leave links in the description box below so you can go and check out some of their poetry. And I would love to know, who are your favourite larger-than-life figures from history? Do leave us a comment letting us know. And if you enjoyed this little history lesson, I think you'll also like this video we made on real-life artists who inspired books. So I will link that here so you can check it out. And we'll see you next time!